This computer. All right, here you go. Okay, let's get started. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenko Yamamoto. I am an architect, a co-chair of Global Practice Network at Boston Society of Architecture.
My name is Yuan. I'm a landscape architect at Hayat, also a new co-chair at the BSA Global Practice Network. And first of all, I would like to thank BSA for making this thing possible and always hosting a lot of high quality events for both the designers community and the general public. And then our Global Practice Network is one of the knowledge communities at BSA. And we host events for bigger audiences like this one, as well as smaller ones that are more practice-based, such as change, lesson learned, and other related sessions, all with the focus on practicing internationally, meaning one, we may work on projects in another country, we may come from another country, or we just want to learn what is happening out there. So I will talk a little bit more about group at the very end of this session. Yeah, Jenko.
Okay, so let's get started. Today, after a brief introduction, we will have a talk by Professor Elvis Garcia, and followed by a voice exchange with a group of designers with diverse cultural backgrounds. And they will share thoughts and observations about their home countries. And we will take questions from the audience, so please send us questions via chat. We will finish our meeting with the introduction of the next event. So Andrea Panizza from EVA Studio will give us a brief introduction of this research they're conducting on social bridging. And I will pass it on to you, Yuan.
I cannot hear you, Yuan.
Hey, Yuan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I grew up in Guangzhou, China. It's a city at the center of outbreak of SARS in 2003. I can still see the image of the little me using boiling water to wash my mask and hang it up under the sun to hope the UV lights will kill the pathogen. And so I was very alert when this crisis started earlier this year. So at the time, I asked a few friends and colleagues, what do you think we as designers can do to help with the situation? And answers I got include maybe we can do some posters using our visual skills to spread the news or try 3D printing. But in general, people find this question very hard to answer, especially if we are not healthcare architects or healthcare planners. We don't feel like we have the expertise to contribute. So Junko and I were thinking maybe we should really take a step back and ask a different question, such as how do we frame our thinking? Meaning, how do we find out answers to this question I asked earlier? And maybe what about under different cultural backgrounds, since this is a global crisis right now. And this is the reason why we're doing this event right now. And we're very happy to have Dr. Elvis Garcia, who works on bridging the gap between epidemics, architecture, and urban planning at Harvard GSD. He actually spends a lot of time studying these questions. So he's here to help us. Elvis, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for, so can I share mine now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me. I guess you can see it now.
Yes.
Yep.
I don't know if.
Nice.
Give me a second. Okay, can you see that now?
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Okay. So well, thank you for bringing me here to this forum. I mean, all that we can actually discuss these things that I've been thinking about for a while, but there has never been a lot of traction to. Partially because the discussion on design is with sustainability and climate change, and not much about health of the people. It's about health of the planet, but we are not there yet to discuss about our health and how designers can actually help improving the health of populations. So my background is in engineering, in architecture, public policy, public health, and I have had the chance to work for many years in epidemics in the field, mainly sub-Saharan Africa. So throughout all these years, I have seen how the role of a designer would help to actually react in epidemics. Can we just build something to, like, kind of a camp, something like that? No? But I believe that now we are in a different stage, and we are ready to tackle the broader question that is actually design the missing link to tackle epidemic. It's not only design something that we do. Can we do some posters for people to learn how to wash their hands? No, I'm talking about is actually design a critical component in our fight against epidemics. So this talk is not much about giving you any question in terms of how we're going to do that, but it's about you being able to answer this. Yeah, after what I'm going to tell is you're going to be able to define by yourself if design is the actual answer for epidemics or not. I normally teach a class, a semester-long class on this. Now we have 20 minutes. So I will try to be succinct and try to be tackling these specific questions. Then we have more time the next hour to maybe discuss other issues. So I will try to lay the foundations first, because I believe that as a designer, we need to understand what an epidemic is, to be able to propose solutions to that. And I think that's what is missing nowadays in design studies. So I will give you just a brief perspective of what an epidemic exists. So why epidemics happen? So epidemics happen basically always the same way. First of all, maybe we should define what an epidemic is. Epidemic is when there is a higher ratio of a disease more than the normal one. So, or there is an onset of a weird disease that we cannot control, that would be considered an epidemic. So an epidemic is very simple to define, and it's even simpler to understand where it comes from. An epidemic always comes from a reservoir. And a reservoir normally is an animal, is a wild animal, or is an insect. Now we have been hearing a lot during this last month after the COVID-19 about bats. And bats are definitely a source of epidemic. However, I share here a cycle where a mosquito is the main biggest vector. And it's because, to me, although everybody's thinking about COVID, mosquito is the most dangerous threat that we have in our lives. For you to be more or less, to give you some numbers, almost around 400,000 children die every year out of malaria. 400,000. We're talking here about huge numbers that repeat year after year. And it just comes from mosquito. We don't hear about that because it's the same as always. This is not happening in our countries. It's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. But just an example. That's why I use mosquito, because it's not the malaria, it's dengue, it's Zika. The mosquito is a big source of epidemics. So how does it work? The reservoir that can be a mosquito or it can be a bat then gets in contact with other animals where it spreads the virus to other animals. These other animals then spread the disease to us. Or it can be the mosquito or the bat straight away to us. But what I want to point out is that there are different ways where this disease can come in contact with us. It doesn't need to be the original reservoir, it can be a secondary. And as it happens a lot with these new epidemics that we have heard lately, that maybe people is not eating bats, but people is eating animals that have been bitten by bats. That's the way. And then once the disease or the virus is inside our body, then we can spread it very easily, either to other people, either by sexual intercourse, or even through having a baby. We can just transmit, as it happened with Zika. And then not only that, once we have the disease, imagine that we have a disease in one country, then we go back to another country where this disease is not prevalent, but actually mosquito can bite us and it could eventually get the virus and spread it to someone else. So it's this kind of things. It's a cycle. It's a cycle, and we have to be aware of how easy it is for us to transmit and to get engaged in this cycle. So, but actually, we haven't heard a lot about pandemics in the past. And when I talk about pandemics, the difference between epidemic and pandemic, as you may know, is that a pandemic is basically the same as an epidemic, but crosses borders to other countries and it becomes wider. So, if I ask in the room, how many pandemics can you name? I will be lucky if I get 4. I will imagine 4 would be my best guess. And why is this? Because people is not really aware. Pandemics are not part of the conversation because we don't want to deal with pandemics because it's very expensive to deal with a pandemic. Since we don't know if it will ever happen. So getting governments to put money into that is a challenge. So this is not a common topic to discuss. So pandemics, there have been a lot. Epidemics, definitely there are many. Every year we have epidemics around the world. Pandemics, there are less, but there are still a lot. And just in the last 100 years, I want to show you a few of them. You may have heard probably about the Spanish flu. That's the biggest one because everybody remembers. It was 2 years ago. It was the 100-year anniversary of the Spanish flu. It killed 50 million people, around maybe double, maybe a bit less. But what I'm interested in this, what I'm showing here is that actually, if you see, there is a trend in these epidemics, more or less. There are a couple of exceptions, but there is a trend. If you can identify it, is that actually at the beginning of the century, the epidemics were more harmful in terms of fatality rates. The numbers you see is dead people. But also there is something also very interesting, is that at the beginning they were more spaced among each other. And if you see now, in the last 10 years, we have 4 or 5 pandemics in the last 10 years, 15 years. And why is that? And why we should be worried about this? So we should be worried because pandemics, they are here to stay. It's not something that just happened today. COVID is not something that happened randomly. We knew it was going to happen. We didn't know how it was going to be called, and we didn't know the fatality rate, but we knew it was happening because we saw it 5 years before. We saw it 6 years before. We saw it 10 years before. And we have seen it that they are closer to each other every year. And why is this happening? So why is this pattern happening? Well, there is a very easy answer. It's human development. I will argue that human development is the responsible for the situation we are in now. We are devastating areas, forests, where we find wild animals. So we actually get in contact with wild species that we were not in contact before. Species that may have viruses that may come then in contact with us. And that's how it starts. I like to show this as an example. When we're talking about human development, we can look into deforestation, and we see how in Africa there is a clear area of deforestation that is West and Center Africa. And it's just this kind of picture following. But then, if we go into Ebola outbreaks in the past, you see that they follow the same pattern of deforestation in Africa. Basically, development it shows there's some kind of correlation on us getting into forest areas and going into these old forests where there was not human contact in the past, and now getting in contact with these new wild species that actually transmit the viruses. But it's not only that. When we have the virus in contact with the people, then what happened? So actually, it's not that much that we just get infected in the forest. Basically, there is a lot of people that is hunting in the forest and is coming to the cities, and that's where the wet markets get into play. That's where these wet markets that you have heard about a while ago because of the onset of the COVID was pointing out them. These markets are basically empty open spaces where people brings animals from wherever and they sell them. You can find alive animals, you can find dead animals, you can find species with each other, species that can actually bite each other, and then we then buy that and then we eat that. There is blood, there's a bit of everything, things that haven't gone through any health inspection, but also the way they are processed is not acceptable in hygienic terms. So I see there is a lot of potential to improve wet markets, and basically these wet markets are in most of the world, most of Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. So what happened? This wouldn't be a problem per se if we were rural communities. If the world was living in small villages and they opened this, if there is an epidemic, if there is a virus, people will spread it in their village, and that's it. Half of the village, or potentially half of the village could even die if there's an Ebola that kills almost 70% of the population, but that's it. But what happened? That we are not in village environment. Now we are in a mainly urban area. And the world has already passed the rural mindset, and now we're growing and growing into cities. Cities are getting bigger and bigger, but actually are actually becoming not the best healthy environment, to call it in a way. And this is why cities are growing, but they're not growing evenly in a nice and futuristic environment where everybody can actually enjoy a better life than in the rural areas. We're actually growing in slums. Now it's currently in the world, there are 1 billion people living in slums. In 2030, it's estimated that between 20 and 30% of population will live in slums. In 2050, around half of the world's population will live in slums. So these are estimations, but I'm pretty sure they are not far. Countries cannot cope with this movement towards cities. Countries don't have the resources to provide healthy environments. People is just living in these areas. People just living surrounded by trash, they lack any sort of healthy water environment, any sort of health and sanitation facilities. So we can imagine how, if we have a disease and that we have a virus that gets into a market. This market is in one of these areas. People in these areas cannot wash their hands. They live cramped in environments, in poor shelter environments. They use really bad sanitation facilities. As it happened, for example, as an example not far from now was Haiti. Haiti has really bad sanitation facilities, and it was that way the cholera got transmitted through all the country, with more than 200,000 or 300,000 cases, 2014, 2015. So this is happening every year, everywhere. What happened? What made it different now? What is the final ingredient for this to become the perfect epidemic storm? So the last ingredient is this. This is more than 200,000 flies a day. Now you have an environment where diseases thrive. That is, a lot of people living in shelter environments in this informal urban settings. We have people who cannot actually control because they live cramped in these environments. They cannot wash their hands. They don't have the appropriate facilities to have a healthy and clean lifestyle. And then you have half of the world basically traveling every day. You have and huge amount of flights and connections, all the cities now are hyper connected. So that's what you needed, just create these pandemics. And that's why we're having more and more pandemics every year, because we have more and more people living in these environments. We're getting into forest areas where we shouldn't be, and then we're flying all around the world instantaneously, very cheaply. So if this is happening, how come we haven't seen more pandemics in the past? We are basically living in a really dangerous environment. And I'm not trying to scare anybody, but it's true. We have been lucky. We have been lucky that we are not seeing more epidemics every year, and more pandemics. Sorry, there have to be some. Actually, there are already some mechanisms in place. So the world hasn't just been looking at it. Experts, public health experts, epidemiologists, they have already been working on it. And they have, so there are a lot of existing mechanisms or organizations in place already that try to surveil for future epidemics. You all have heard about, for sure, WHO, and that writes guidelines, tries to oversee what's going on, and tries to make sound the alarm in anything happens. But we have also the CDC in the US, but there are also like other organizations like the HSA, HIR, CEPI. So all these names don't mean anything to you probably, but there are already existing mechanisms that evaluate and suggest and put money into countries to be prepared to avoid epidemics. That being said, this doesn't look that it's being enough, because we have all this in place, but we still have COVID. How COVID happened and why we couldn't see it. Well, this is not as easy as it looked like. It's not about only trying to put some mechanisms in place. In fact, the US is the highest ranked country on the IHR indicators. That this indicator shows how ready you are to prevent or to fight an epidemic. So the USA is the first country by far, but you see what's happening in the US. So all these mechanisms, although theoretically, and they have probably worked very well, to some extent, they are not enough to prevent epidemics. And we have other mechanisms like CEPI. It's the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. It's basically this mechanism that you may have heard lately, where we're trying to launch early vaccines. They put money into developing vaccines that potentially become vaccines to prevent, to fight an epidemic or a pandemic. So there are mechanisms that there's a lot of money behind, but it's not easy. It's not easy. So what is my point here? What I'm trying to do? So I'm trying to say that maybe we need something else, more than just health professionals, and we need more than mechanisms in place, run and managed by government and health authorities. Maybe we need also other disciplines to come through and play a role. And this is not something new at all. There's nothing new. And I like to talk about John Snow, the epidemiology or the physician from 1850 in London. I think he was the first person who actually thought far beyond his own discipline, and I'm talking about this topic, and look into something else. It's like kind of thinking out of the box. In that time, there was a cholera epidemic, and they were not very knowledgeable about bacteria and viruses. But John Snow, thinking, he looked at the map in London and looked into the water infrastructure, and kind of saw trends in different neighborhoods, how some people getting water from some areas was getting sick, and some people even in the neighborhoods getting water from somewhere else, they were not getting as sick as the others, or they were not getting sick at all. And that's why he identified a water pump as the source of the cholera epidemic. And it was the milestone from the point where actually designers, urban planners, became in contact with water, with health authorities. So this is nothing new. This has been there, but we have forgot about it. Our role as designers is to be more involved with health authorities, and not only to send them some posters, but also to propose how we can design cities, how we can help in slums, how we can design response, how we can do all those things to prevent or to mitigate the impact of the disease. So it can be from designing an aerial water system in a slum like in Kibera, or it can be a response to a COVID like now as it happens in Madrid, or it can be maybe a city like in Denmark where you basically develop autonomous cells that may potentially be isolated in times while there is an epidemic going on. So there is a lot designers can do. So I didn't want, as I mentioned at the beginning, I didn't want to tell you what you should be doing. I just wanted to answer this question. Probably and hopefully now you are able to answer this and to answer that when someone is asking, has design anything to do? I think we should be able to say that yes, design is the missing link to tackle epidemics. And yeah, that's where I'm ending.
Okay, thank you very much, Elvis. While we digest...
I am on time, yes?
Yes, perfect. While we digest your presentation, I'm going to move to, I'm going to show our screen here.
Yeah, I try to be as
perfect timing.
As quick as possible and as fast as I could. Sorry, I didn't give you much more answers or more examples of what things can do, but I'm so looking forward for you guys to tell me what are you doing in your countries, or what do you see can be done in your country. So yeah.
Sure. So we will move on to the panel discussion. And again, for the audience, please leave your questions to Elvis or to us in the chat, and then we'll come back to it later. And we have a diverse group of people on the panel, and each of them will share their thoughts and observations about their home country in response to the pandemic. And they were given a set of questions beforehand so that they can also share their answers in some of these questions. And questions are as follows. In your home country, what do you find particularly challenging when it comes to preventing, controlling, and responding to the disease outbreak? And how do you think these can or should be addressed? And what aspect of design do you think is working? What do you think will change in the ways designers approach design? So they will introduce themselves when they present, and each one will have 3 minutes to share. So to all the participants, as we discussed, feel free to jump in to respond and react to each one's mini presentation. And again, for the audience, please leave questions in the chat. So let's get started with Say, please.
Hey everyone, can you guys hear me?
Yes. Yes.
I'm Say, I'm an associate principal at CBT Architects, I practice in Boston. I am here representing Korea, South Korea. Korea was one of the first countries to be severely hit with COVID-19, and for the most part, Korea has been doing an incredible job of containing the disease, as many of you have heard. Usually the time that I hear about Korea is when, on the news, is when North Korea is doing something crazy. But so this is a very unusual case. But anyway, I think there were 3 key factors in how Korea contained the virus. The first was the government's response. There was a consistent message and protocol that came from the central government to the local authorities, to the hospitals, and to the people about the severity of the situation and the appropriate response. And these were well-informed, science-based messages coming from the country's top medical experts. The second factor was the people acting responsibly and fulfilling their civic duty. The frontline workers, the general public, everyone. I mean, of course, there are exceptions. But for the most part, it was people acting responsibly. The third was the availability and the allocation of resources and the speed in which that happened. The testing facilities were set up very quickly, and information was disseminated as to how to get tested where. Implementation of technology was key in making all of these pieces come together. And we all know that it's one thing to have the testing capacity, but it's another thing to get people actually tested. Korea has had a universal healthcare system for more than 3 decades now. And it's one of the most advanced countries when it comes to technology and healthcare. So when all of these sort of go side by side with the government doing their part and the people doing their job, I think it's very hard to go wrong. So the big question is, so then what are the challenges? Well, I think the challenge is that design, as a designer, I think the challenge is that design is not being discussed as a key element in solving the current crisis. And I think Elvis sort of really, sort of outlined the sort of the context in which, these kind of discussion should happen. I think everyone is seeing this as just a public health issue with an economic implication, of course, but it actually is just as much of a design issue as it is a public health issue. It is just as much of a governance issue as it is an equity issue. And this challenge is perhaps not specific only to Korea, but probably many other countries too. But I think when the time comes to discussing a solution to the pandemic problem with the decision makers, I think designers will not have a seat at the table if we keep doing business as usual. So I've been seeing a lot of designers come up with, responses and proposals as a response to COVID-19. Most of them are being reactive to the current crisis by responding to only the physical and hygiene aspect of the problem, when our solution should be doing much more. So what we shouldn't forget is that the pandemic does not replace other pressing challenges that existed before COVID-19, such as climate change, equity, housing, and so forth. And our biggest contribution as designers to the current crisis, I don't think should be a series of one-off design solutions, but something that is embedded within a larger framework that integrates the pandemic solutions to the climate change solutions, to the policy solutions, to the supply chain solutions, and so forth. So I think architects and designers have the skill set and the insights, to do this. So one of the things that we do at CBT is when we do make a design decisions, one of the criteria that we go by is what value does this design move bring to the project? And it can't just be an aesthetic move, or it can't just be a sustainable move. It needs to do, it needs to solve 2 or more issues with a single move. So I think in the same token, we need to ask ourselves, what values can designers bring to the current issues that go beyond addressing just spatial and hygiene issues. So I hope that we can use the current crisis as an opportunity to position ourselves, and not as someone who designs a product or an outcome, but as an agent that synthesizes various values and considerations of our society. And I'll leave it at that.
Sounds great. Thank you, Say. If you have any comments or response to each one's presentation, please feel free to jump in to the panelists. And we are moving through each panelist's presentation fairly quickly due to the time constraints. So I would like to move on to Taka.
Hi, I'm Taka, and I'm a planner at Sasaki. I'm here representing Japan. I'll briefly share key challenges in Japan and my observations or ideas to wrestle with them. Japanese cities are struggling, but they chose to sustain the economy to the extent possible while coping with the COVID-19. So the level of lockdown is a little modest compared to that of the United States. So that's the assumption. And most of Japanese cities are vulnerable to the financial impact of the COVID-19 because they heavily rely on income tax and tourism and hotel tax revenue. And from the public sector's perspective, this means that some local cities might not be able to provide basic services and actually have a normal society if they don't get help from the central government. And in fact, the number of international tourists decreased by 93% in March compared to that of last year, which is really dramatic figure. And I have some friends actually running hotels and restaurants in Tokyo, and they had to choose to close the businesses. One of the biggest questions for the future of cities, I think, is what becomes of low-wage workers, who are a big part of urban populations, but often work in jobs impossible to do from work home. And the restaurant industry, for example, employs more than 11 million people in the United States and 5 million in Japan. But the question is, like, how do we integrate them? How do we provide job opportunities for them? Additionally, I think another big challenge for a country like Japan is something related to the notion of diversity and inclusion. There are many internationals in Japan today, but it's still a very homogeneous country. 90% are perceived as Japanese. And I feel like the outbreak of COVID-19 made people a little conservative to the idea of diversity and inclusion in a home country. So we live in a world of globalism, but I personally feel the trend has shifted a little bit backwards in a sense. But there are things also working, like New York. Most metropolitan cities in Japan, like Tokyo and Osaka, are pretty dense, which was primarily attributed to transit-oriented development, TOD, with a strong focus on public transportation networks. And reading some newspapers and articles, density is said to be a big factor in the pandemic. But with the availability of transportation networks and options, cities and companies or economies can choose the way of operation during the emergency, I think. So we might have to wait for a little bit, but density in cities like Tokyo concentrate resources and social services where needed. So the residents have quicker access to hospitals and healthcare services. Again, there'll be many changes in planning design, but I think how people behave in a pandemic is probably not a perfect guide to how people want to live their lives in normal times. That said, to overcome challenges, we may need a radical change in a way we live or a more long-term perspective. So in the late 19th century in the US, there was, as you know, there was a public park movement led by landscape architects such as Olmsted and Charles Eliot. They try to solve urban social problems through the reform of urban space. It is, of course, important to revisit the value of nature and landscape, but that does not mean a mere creation of public parks would solve the entire issue, I would say. So issues are more complex now, and I think we have to have more larger or systematic or philosophical changes towards to the way we live. We might have the outbreak of other diseases in 10 years or even in 3 years. We never know. So the battle against viruses ultimately, in my understanding, the war between nature and civilization. Thus, I think it's vital for society to make advances in planning and design because it has become difficult to pursue prosperity and growth and sustainability at the same time. This creates an ethical dilemma that we face today and has provoked environmental problems on a global scale. So I would like to conclude by saying that I think it's an obligation and not a luxury to develop our cities in a progressive and environmentally responsible way. And I think this is the chance or opportunities for all of us to think through more big ideas towards to the prevention of COVID-19 and other diseases for the later.
Thank you, Taka. I agree with Say and Taka saying this is an opportunity, and I do believe that this pandemic is giving us an opportunity to reconceptualize the use of our resources. And since I am from Japan as well, I'm going to add a couple of comments that speaking of the quality of life, for example, we've been seeing people in Europe, for example, and they are using balconies to connect with neighbors during quarantine. But balconies in Japan are more of a private space and also utilitarian space, especially in urban area. So people would not see neighbors from balconies or connect with them. And it's typically for hanging laundries, for example. And so I'm thinking of that, maybe semi-public space may become more valuable. And there might be an opportunity there for the designers to propose new ways of using balconies in Japan. That is just something that came to mind. All right, we have another presentation. The next one will have images. So we'll move on to Ponapa, please.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yes, perfect.
Good. Hi, my name is Paula Paprika. I am a landscape architect working at Sasaki and live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was born and raised in Bangkok, Thailand, and I lived there for more than half of my life. So today I'm going to talk about what happened in Thailand. So Thai government respond to the pandemic using a lockdown order. This means forbidden tourists and foreigners to enter the country and prohibited non-essential business to operate. Advise high-risk group of people to stay home and the rest to practice social distancing. This, of course, led to a lot of challenges in all the fields, and Thai people are trying their best to practice social distancing, as you can see in the image. With the time we have today, I'm going to talk about only one intervention that accommodates people to access to the food source while keeping social distancing. If you have been to Bangkok, you know it's a mega city with extreme urban agglomeration. This makes the land use around the edge of the city become homogeneous and full with gated community. The infrastructure such as public transportation system, essential amenities, or park network cannot develop fast enough to serve population in this suburb area. So when the lockdown order was issued, people who live around this area are the ones who get impacted the most, especially to access to food source. Wet markets are very commonplace to buy grocery around the edge of Bangkok. So this is an example of how normal wet market look like. So in the market, each stall sells specific goods. And by the time that shoppers get everything they need, they would be exposed to at least like 5 sellers. This is not including at least 2 types of transportation modes that they need to take to reach the market. So when I was young, my house also be considered as a suburb. So there was this type of grocery food truck that will come to the village daily to serve people who suddenly ran out of some cooking ingredients. The produce are more expensive, but it saves your trip to the market. People call this truck a pumpuang truck, which means a bunch of hanging things, because the truck has limited storage space. So the most efficient way is to pack all the produces in the bag and hang it around the truck. So this truck kind of exists today, but it's very rare. When the lockdown order was issued, the government partnered with large wet markets to set up a system for these grocery food trucks to operate. So the wet market role changed. It's turned into a hub for loading essential goods. And each truck will have a specific route that it will run, have a specific schedule, like will be in each gated community for half an hour or 1 hour and then circle. And in order to make sure every area get covered and it's easy to track down if someone got infected, there is a safety guideline for the truck operator to follow. Also, there are different ways for people to track down the truck, such as hotline or social medias. So instead of you travel to the market travels to you. this not only reduces the exposure the shoppers will have, but also helps people who lost their jobs to earn some income in the meantime. So currently there are a lot of creative iterations of the track coming out. And in my opinion, this is maybe, well, interesting strategy as it uses what already existed based on local culture and context and reorganized it to serve a larger system and adjust it to accommodate the current situation of COVID-19. And when I think about how we think about the design during this time, maybe it's similar to something like this when we look at things we already have and maybe have been overlooked, observing what people organize it and adapt it to the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. We are moving on to the next person. Marisol,
Okay.
please.
So, first of all, thank you, Jenko and Juan, for organizing this, and Elvis for sharing your experience. My name is Marisol Rivas Brito. I'm a half Brazilian, half Paraguayan architect, currently working in New York with architecture and urban design. I was born and raised in São Paulo, which is the most populous city of Brazil and the 12th of the world. This is an aerial view of the metropolitan area of São Paulo for you to have an idea. And it is a continuous urban fabric composed by 39 municipalities. 21 million people live in São Paulo. Well, actually more than 21 million. And in São Paulo's metropolitan area, which is roughly 10% of Brazilian population. So next slide. This is a comparative with Boston, how Boston would fit inside of São Paulo's footprint for you to have an idea of the scale. We can move to the next one. São Paulo is an alpha global city, which is a primary node for the global economic network, but such wealth is not well distributed. And I mean that per capita, but also geographically within the metropolitan area. So we are still facing the beginning of the pandemic and dealing with some serious political issues. We have a leadership which is against social distancing and encourages public rallies. But in terms of design, specifically, the uneven distribution of wealth and access to infrastructures and equipment in the city is, in my opinion, the source of our main challenges at this point. So as a consequence of that, there are many distinct realities inside of the same city to be dealt with, and solutions and safety protocols that are easy to implement in the wealthier neighborhoods. They are hard to apply to low-income neighborhoods and even to informal settlements. We can move to the next image. This is a very iconic shot taken by a Brazilian photographer called Tuca Vieira. It is not a montage. And it illustrates well my point. So how can we rely on social distance when you have high density and narrow streets? How can you ask someone to wash their hands several times a day for 20 seconds if they don't even have tap water all day long? How can you ask someone to isolate itself from when it's sick, when this person is sharing a room with the other 5 people? And especially if the context of an economic crisis that comes with a health crisis, where there's a tendency for people to go back to vulnerable situations if they lose their jobs and they can't pay for their rents. So on the right side, this is not a new problematic. And during the past decades, like many discussions were happening about the social role of the property and the right to the city. Those became more urgent in the context of a pandemic. And there's many interesting instruments that were actually like waiting for some political will to be properly implemented. We do have a public health system with established protocols to reach the most vulnerable people. It is not perfect, but something interesting that is happening, especially inside of those informal settlements, is that people are using those protocols, they are adapting them to some of those communities so they can help each other and quickly identify new needs and changing situations inside of their fabric, their neighborhood. Also, we have some initiatives as fabrication labs and public universities looking for new solutions for the lack of means to fight the crisis. So in my opinion, there seems to be some growing awareness about the role of the built environment for the well-being of the population, about the cooperation possibility between fields, and about some broader sense of community too. So, I mean, we are still going up the curve. We will see what the future leads us. But after all, I believe that the built environment should be a product of society and not the other way around. So let's see what happens.
Thank you very much, Marisol. And I think density is a big issue to a lot of places in the world. The next presentation is also related to that. Nawal, please.
You can hear me, I think, now. Hi,
Perfect.
how are you doing? So, Noel from Algeria. I'm an architect designer living in Boston area. Starting off with your first question, I would say the most challenging thing is to get the support and help assistance to everyone, from the north to the south, and from obviously east to west. This is a real dilemma in my country because of the failure of our government and administration that has intentionally centralized the main social and economic infrastructures of the country in the capital, Algiers. Therefore, people who live in Algiers and in its vicinity are somehow more advantageous than the others when it comes to getting healthcare. As an example, during this COVID-19, you have much more chances to find the testing available in Algiers, which is the capital, as opposed to the cities that are only 300 kilometers far away. So answering to your second and third question, obviously this challenge should be addressed literally by our government, but due to its incapacity to act and bring in solutions, our population has finally understood that they should act by themselves to save their life during this pandemic, for example. Therefore, they thought of an emergent solution that could become an aspect of design to develop in the future in order to prepare ahead of time and face such a horrible pandemic. Indeed, they started to rehab existing buildings that are abandoned 20 years ago due to many reasons. So as we can see on the pictures, this is one of the existing building that was functioning 20 years ago. So so the idea is that these kind of buildings are located outside of the capital, Algiers, and also they were intentionally in the mountain forest. So that plan was initially traced in this purpose because they believe that such healthcare services, which are mainly dedicated to cure the pulmonary and respiratory diseases, are the nature is the best environment for to answer to this kind of to deal with this kind of diseases. So I would say even the pandemic, it applies equally to the pandemic, to our current pandemic, COVID-19. So I would, to conclude and to expand somehow on what Dr. Elvis mentioned earlier in terms of autonomous cells to face the pandemic, I would say in terms of urban planning, the idea of expanding the infrastructures towards the nature and fleeing the hectic cities could play a major role in preventing the spread of a horrendous pandemic such as COVID-19 and also treating it. Yeah. So just to go back to the first images, Jenko. So I'm just basically showing the infrastructure in Algiers, in our capital. Some scroll down, please. Yeah, so where the economic and social infrastructures are located, the main buildings are located, like the hospitals, so hospitals, main schools, and so on. And then this is the north part, the north city. So paradoxically, to the south area, so down, this is a city, a large city now in our south area, which is really famous, a beautiful one, built traditionally. And so, as you can notice, are all traditional houses. Mainly, the urban identification is mainly residences, as opposed to the north, where you can find more elaborate infrastructures and so on. Yeah, so basically, this is the main challenge that we are facing in Algeria. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Noel. So we would like to move on to the next. Noreen, please.
Thank you, Jenko. Hi, everyone. My name is Noreen Mazumdar. I'm an architectural designer at Payet Associates in Boston, but I'm originally from the capital city of Dhaka in Bangladesh. I'd like to start off with an image of Dhaka. What you see here depicts one of the most densely populated cities in the world with a population of 21 million. This, combined with a major shortage of land, leads to unplanned and unregulated urbanization. Now, I'd like to ask you all, how can you imagine controlling a pandemic in a city that looks like this? The medical infrastructure of the country is also in jeopardy due to the lack of urban planning with a very limited number of hospitals. To put things into perspective, the entire country's healthcare system has about 1,200 total ICU beds for 160 million people. The average household has more than 5 members and usually includes 3 generations. More than 80% of households living in urban slums share a single water source with 5 or more other households. You can therefore kind of understand why in Bangladesh, social distancing truly is a privilege. To practice the social distancing norms that most Western countries rely on in order to reduce the transmission of coronavirus is almost an impossible feat. There are some, however, some encouraging news. If you could go to the next slide, Jenko. Despite a pretty slow start and response, the government has begun to show some signs of urgency. Most recently, they've declared transportation in the city to be shut down, as you can see in the image, a contrast before and after the lockdown on one of the main roads. They've also mandated that all offices be closed, and they've even deployed the army to enforce social distancing in public. Additionally, in an effort to tackle the urban density, the government has encouraged low-income citizens to return to their rural villages where they would be provided with government aid. The final image I'd like to show speaks 1,000 words on its own. In an impoverished, overcrowded, and chaotic country, the role of design may seem pretty grim, but however, some of the immediate solutions could include for the public and private sector conglomerates to convert their trade and convention centers into treatment facilities for COVID patients. Universities perhaps could even be mobilized to provide premises for quarantine centers. Lastly, the ready-made garment sector in the country, which is the second largest in the world, could use their available resources to maybe locally manufacture masks and even gowns. In reality, though, due to COVID-19, already $3.5 billion worth of garments orders have been canceled, leaving factory workers a lot more vulnerable than ever before. Similarly, measures taken by the government have caused other local industries to suffer, triggering the serious problem of poverty in the nation. The ripple effect of this on the economy has been devastating, especially for the poor. This makes us truly wonder, what is more lethal, the virus itself or the economic implications of the virus in a country like Bangladesh? I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Noreen. I think that question applies to a lot of places in the world, and the question about the economy, the economic impact is always a big question that is sort of difficult to tackle. And the next person, Tina, please.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Tina. I'm currently working as a design professional at Al-Amzai, representing Iran. So I think most challenging thing for Iran was the fact that they went through this after years of extreme sanctions and recent internal and global tensions. So for the past 6 months, as you all have heard on the news, there were protests inside Iran. There were some tension between the United States and Iran in Iraq. And then there was a tragic accident that was the Ukrainian flight. And so there was a huge division between Iranian people and the government going through this. So there was a problem. I think the biggest problem was people not trusting the government, and also government not taking serious action and enforcement because they've been dealing with a lot of issues outside and inside of Iran. So there were people that financially struggling. That was the other challenge because of economic sanction and mismanagement in the government. The most challenges in Iran, I think, they were politically and economically rather than architecturally in urban planning, because in urban planning in Iran, usually in like 5-minute walk from your home, you'll find a small local baker or butcher or a fresh produce shop that it's easier to do social distancing. So it's very norm to be able to get what you need whenever you need it and be able to practice social distancing in Iran, most of the places. But the challenge was mainly, I think, to have equal distribution of health facility in Iran across the nation. Very much like other people that said most sources are focused on mainly are in major cities in different states rather than everywhere. So that was a huge problem, I think. But going into the future and how design can be, how designer can approach in Iran, I think there should be a better understanding of urban planning. And because the new design of urban planning don't consider 6-foot wide sidewalk as we do here, so there's not much of like restricted codes being implied on urban planning or zoning. And I think that should be the approach in the future. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Tina. We're going to move on to the last person. Mac, please.
Mac, you are on mute. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, everyone.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great conversation so far, Professor. That was a phenomenal presentation. I think it bears a lot of semblance to many of the challenges that we face in Ghana and most parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. That being the case, I think this COVID-19 has sort of shed light on how unprepared we are for grand challenges of this sort. And I think our cases have, in many ways, have been, one way or the other, exacerbated by a number of factors that I would like to touch upon. One is poor infrastructure. You know, most of the poor areas in Ghana do not have adequate infrastructure, and a lot of houses are sort of compound houses where you have an agglomeration of people from different parts of Ghana coming together and having to use many of the resources in the house, like toilets, bath houses. You have people who have to line up to be able to do some of these things, and I think that sort of makes it very difficult to control things of this sort, or to curtail the spread of many of these diseases. Ghana just came back from, in many ways, 2 weeks of lockdown. And I think that was particularly very, very difficult, one way or the other, because of a number of factors. One is lack of social protection for a lot of very vulnerable people. As Professor mentioned earlier, Ghana has witnessed over the years a number of migrations from rural areas of the country to the city, basically Accra and Kumasi, which are like the largest cities, because of people do not have enough opportunities in many of these areas. So they're moving to cities so that they can have access to them. I remember one of the things that they actually struggled with in terms of this containing people within, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, was there's a migration of a particular group of people called Kayaye, and they usually move from the north of Ghana to the city. And they become people, just like petty workers. They help people carry bags, things of the sort. And when COVID-19 happened, they had to be sent back to where they came from without even social protection. So that you have all of these people who migrated from rural areas that are moving to cities and having to be sent back to where they came from. They don't know how they're going to feed. They don't know, how they're going to be able to have access to basic necessities of life. And that was particularly difficult. But aside from that, even in the two major cities that this happened, people were beginning to complain about the lack of access to food. We don't have enough social protection for a lot of people, just like we do here. People are able to get the stimulus package. It's none of the sort. So it makes it very difficult for the average person to be able to abide by the rules. And so people got angry, and this was only 2 weeks, and it's been lifted. That being the case, we have about 1,000 cases. So I'm actually really, really afraid that this is going to be catastrophic, because we haven't been able to curtail the spread of the disease, but we've come out of lockdown. So that's as far as I would say many of the challenges that we're facing. But in terms of how design could play a role, I think a number of ways. One is urban planning. How do we provide infrastructure, particularly housing, to many of these underprivileged communities, like in the slums and all of that, so they can have access to basic amenities like a place to take a shower, a public toilet, things of the sort. These all make it very, very difficult. And over the next couple of decades, Africa is going to witness the largest migration of people from rural areas to urban areas. We're going to have about 50%. So how do we provide opportunities in urban and rural areas so that people would be prevented from moving to cities? As far as food is concerned, how do we provide storage facilities that we will be able to preserve food for the longest amount of time, so that we'll be able to provide resilience against many of these grand challenges that the world is going to face? Because this is only the tip of the iceberg. Because if you're familiar with the kind of historiography, climate change is going to have the biggest effect in Africa. We're going to have droughts, or we're going to have a lot more challenges than many other places on the planet. So I think this is, in many ways, has provided, I would say, a fodder for how we think about how do we begin to design smarter cities to contain many of these challenges. How do we begin to be more intense about urban planning? Because in Ghana, Jenko, you know as well as I do, like houses are like sort of haphazardly, built. One is facing east, there's no zoning laws. People are just sort of haphazard in the way they do things. So when you have, even when there's rain, the way sort of like water flows in the cities are all very problematic, and you have sort of the stagnant water with a lot of mosquitoes and all of that. So these are all very, very big challenges, and I think we really haven't had a grip on the essence of design in solving these challenges. And I think this COVID-19 crisis has sort of jolted us into the need to begin to think very deeply about how we can sort of incorporate design into it. So transportation, how do we even begin to think about how do we build transportation systems that allow people to social distance? Very, very difficult at the moment. How do we build a train system that allows people to migrate from one end of the city to the other? So these are all grand challenges, and I think we really haven't sort of thought very deeply, and this has sort of allowed us in one way or the other to begin to think very deeply about how to go forward as far as curtailing pandemics in the future. So that's as far as I have to say in regards to Ghana.
Okay, thank you very much, Mac. It has been a great exchange of various voices, and we were all curious to hear the situation in different countries. And I'm going to open this to the panel, and also we would like to take some questions from the audience, and Yuan is going to make an executive decision to pick some questions.
Okay, I actually see not a lot of questions, but let me read out the first one. So, so far, this is from Bin. Not sure if I pronounced this correctly. So far, I saw animals and humans play major roles in virus transmission. Are plants part of virus transmission cycle? What is the chance for a virus to be transmitted from plants to human or from plants to animals? Maybe, Elvis, do you think you can answer the question?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I'm first time. Honestly, I have to say that it's first time I hear a question like that. I've never even thought about it. I don't think that's a thing. Plant to human transmission, viral transmission. So that shouldn't be an issue.
Okay, and then, so this is from Paula. So in conclusion, what would you consider that would be the best strategies in urban design to deal with the density of cities in both healthy and impoverished countries? Whoever want to answer that?
I think problem is not density per se, like as, who said that? I don't know, like, well, someone else like from the panelists said that like when you have density, you also have like a facilitated access to infrastructure. So for example, in São Paulo, one of the problems that when people have to move to the center of the city to work or to access some public equipment. So it's not density per se, but like how we build this density in a way, like taking in consideration basic things, like for example, access to sunlight or adequate sidewalks or a rate of air renovation inside of the environment. So my point is, I don't think that density per se is the problem, is how we are building this density.
Yeah, I agree. Just quickly, when it comes to designers' contributions, that's been a question. Urban density can be controlled to some extent by design, but population growth is not really controllable by our profession. So I think what we need to look at is the approach or design that can accommodate the growing population in dense development and that are resilient to global crises like this.
I think just to add on that, I don't think it's a single strategy that's going to be a problem for all. I think it'll be a series of strategies. One of the things that we are noticing, I think it was also mentioned in one of the Ghana, I think it was Ghana presentation. But I think the focus on, no, I think it was Algiers presentation, sorry. I think, one of the things that we need to start doing is focusing less on large hubs, but creating more local hotspots. And I think, the case in Algiers is not just specific to Algiers, but it is also happening, we see those happening in many other cities where, we are seeing hospitals and we're seeing schools that are somewhat focused on certain neighborhoods as opposed to being distributed sort of throughout the city. So I would say that one of the strategies to making sure that decentralizing or distributing some of these facilities would be one of the strategies, which is different from de-densifying. Okay, I think there are differences between the two, and I think another strategy could be focusing on less permanent interventions, but more temporal interventions. We're seeing, how a lot of the robust public space infrastructure can be sort of converted to accommodate, these kind of a pandemic sort of situations, whether that means, as simple as just closing down the roads so that more people can have space, or whether it means converting public spaces into more of a hospital or medical facilities. I think it's critical that these infrastructure or these public spaces have the infrastructure to be able to quickly convert modality when these kind of a crisis happen, because we don't want to be living in an environment where the entire neighborhood is designed around only. So I think that this kind of a temporal nature and making sure that we have more sort of those kind of situations is critical.
Jenko?
Yes.
And adding to what Say just said, so I think in order to create these infrastructures or to expand them throughout the country, I think this is a crucial decision initiative that should be made by the country decision makers. So from that point, if this elite of the country creates this layout throughout equally throughout the country, I believe that everyone will not have any issue moving outside the capital. So as human nature, we are all looking for the best location that offers us the best utilities and means and tools. So if this is thoughtfully planned ahead of time by the government, by the country by whoever is in charge of providing the decisions in terms of urban planning. So I think the infrastructure definitely need to be expanded, and in this way we will be able to decrease the density of the big cities, and in this way we will be easily applying whatever orders that we are facing during any pandemic, so like the COVID-19, the social distancing, as you've noticed that it's pretty challenging in the areas where they never been in such, they never lived in such areas. So if we plan in a smart way ahead of time, obviously, I really love the idea of Dr. Elvis when he said one of the solutions would be creating an autonomous cells. That's really one of the solutions to creating to decrease the density of the big cities.
Thank you, Noel. Well, density is a big topic, like I said, and it's important. Well, density can be very important when it comes to sustainability, for example. Maybe we should make another event talking about density and infrastructure. So we need to move on to, we need to wrap up our meeting here. And it was a lot of information to digest today, and it's not our goal to reach a single conclusion or solution, and we hope that we take the information we shared as food for thought in the future. So we would like to introduce the next event. There are many designers conducting research in response to the pandemic, and Andrea Panizzo, co-founder of Eva Studio, yes, based in UK, will give us a brief introduction of the research his studio is conducting. So I will pass it on to you, Andrea.
Perfect. And thank you, Junko, first of all, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Let me share the screen. Can you see?
Perfect.
Perfect. So just quick introduction about our studio. I'm the co-founder of EVA Studio. Since 2014, EVA Studio team has been providing urban and architectural design solution from London, Haiti, and Lebanon. People and places are at the core of our practice philosophy. We at EVA Studio acknowledge the value of people's solution while responding to situational scarcity, both in the global south and in developed countries. Our work in Haiti focuses on community infrastructure in different informal neighborhoods, with the aim of providing people with a sense of ownership of a public good and creating stronger and community ties. Our work includes public spaces, community centers, public schools, and a public park. Our project in Lebanon focuses on the reactivation of dismissed public space in a vulnerable neighborhood, with the aim of fostering social inclusion between refugees and a host population. So finally, in London, we have developed a new model for affordable modular housing with a focus on collective living and shared spaces. So this is a quick introduction of an ongoing research we had just started about social bridging at the time of a pandemic. These days, images like this one, an unusually empty Piazza San Marco in Venice, are very popular in the news. Cities are rapidly becoming dystopian ghost towns, lacking any sign of street life at the expense of both urban life and desire for social connection. Measures taken by the governments are essentially spatial limitation. Social distancing, of course, the terms that designed to mark and define this crazy 2020. Public parks and other traditional gathering spaces are now closed. And to protect ourselves and the most vulnerable, people worldwide are asked to stay at home. As an emerging reality, this ongoing outbreak is mostly affecting residents from vulnerable groups and deprived areas, where people, prior to this crisis, had little or no access to neither public neither private amenities. Additionally, according to housing charity shelters, hundreds of thousands of families across the UK live in inadequate and overcrowded dwellings. Because of spatial limitations, closure of traditional public spaces, and self-confinement in inadequate housing, many citizens feel trapped within the constraints of domestic walls. What is becoming clearer in the past weeks is that there is an emerging need for social interaction among the individuals. While new apps such as Zoom or House Party are enable people to maintain communication with colleagues and friends and loved ones, they cannot ultimately replace the urban life and the opportunities for real social interaction. So how is then possible to maintain real face-to-face social relations with our individual while respecting physical distancing? We have observed that the need for social bridging can take different forms. It benefits from actors as well as spectators. Taking part or being entertained are both beneficial and effective ways to participate and partake in civic life. This is seen in collective exercise classes hosted from balconies in Spain and in Italy, residents playing balcony bingo in Dublin, Italian musician performance from the neighbors, or even the collective protest of Brazilians against Bolsonaro while using kitchen utensils. So ultimately, we think that the use of the term social distancing is actually misleading. What is needed to respect the government's advice is physical distancing, not a break with the social types per se. Today, citizens are coming together, proposing different ideas for social interaction that we call social bridging, which is well illustrated in these photos of two men in Italy sharing lunch around an improvised table across balconies. So while kitchens and living rooms have been rearranged into temporary office with streets being deserts and parks closed, spaces such as balconies, circulation corridors, rooftops, and terraces are being turned into innovative DIY solutions to accommodate this need for social interaction. These spaces belong to both the architectural and the urban, both the architectural and the urban scale, and they are located in the threshold between public and private space. Boundaries that today somehow seems to dissolve. In Southern Europe, the balcony in particular has played for centuries a ceremonial role and a participatory function. In the Italian Casa di Ringhiera, in the Milanese Casa di Ringhiera, which literally means guardrail houses, built back in the days for the working class, a collective balcony provides access to the individual dwelling units and a space also for social relations. Today, this innovative form of social bridging presents us with the opportunity also to rethink these spaces located at the edge of the private dwellings in other contexts. In the Europe, for instance, where the climate is obviously different, these spaces have been often, for a very long time, have been often overlooked by local policies, city planner, regulation, even by the resident themselves. For example, balconies in a place like London are often used as storages. So understanding the weaknesses of existing infrastructure and improving dwelling and urban spaces during or after a disease outbreak is certainly not a new thing, as Elvis explained earlier when he was talking about the London cholera outbreak in 1854. So in this slide, we start asking ourselves a series of questions. What can we as architects learn from this current crisis? Are we able, as designers, to hear this loud collective call for social interaction? Is it just a temporary necessity, or this need goes much beyond the specific moment? Can we rethink these spaces of encounter and interaction rather than consider those just extension of private spaces? Can these spaces provide a place for people to keep social relations and fight the decline of civic life? Not only in the case of another epidemic outbreak, but also in more normal times. As an example, communal alleyways or balconies and terraces with a more generous width of 1.5 meter, which is normally like the turning circle diameter of a wheelchair, can provide a space where people can actually respect this physical distancing in a case of an epidemic, or in normal time, the same space can be used in various ways. This logic can be applied to key design principles such as natural ventilation in shared spaces, for instance. So we are currently researching on social media, different examples of how people in different contexts, different countries, actually turning into these spaces as a way to escape these constraints of the domestic walls. You can find all of this in our Instagram account. So the objectives of this research that we're just starting are mapping the current wider landscape of these innovative ways to partake in social life, understanding how these spaces, sometimes redefining the boundary between public and private, work in different climates, different cultural contexts, and varying dwelling typologies, and ultimately exploring how possible long-term strategy could actually build a stronger notion of collective space, social bridging, and urban resilience. So at this moment, we are looking for partners, for ideas, for suggestions. So if you have any example in mind, please contact me at andrea@evastudio.co.uk, and our Instagram account is evastudio, eva.studio.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrea. So those questions that he raised are the homework for the next event. And so he will give us a talk in more detail in May. And together with him, Atelier Bawa will join from Japan and will share the research they are conducting in the next event.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So at the same time, I would encourage everyone to look at the chat. Say and Taka replied to some of the questions we didn't have the chance to answer, and they're really great. And then just before we end, I want to explain a little bit more about BSA's Global Practice Network. We try to connect professionals in Boston and around the globe for knowledge sharing, thought exchanging, networking, and showcasing on all aspects of architectural and design practices. So we are a strong advocate for Boston's collective talent, and we strive to help the community both at a firm level and at the individual level. So there will be more events on the practicing side in the future as well. So if you practice internationally and would like to share or hear from your fellow practitioners, or you're just interested in the topic, please look out for our events and then send us your thoughts, ideas to me and Junko to our email addresses. Yeah, Junko. Junko has something.
Okay. Okay, we're going to wrap up our meeting with a final remark that, well, we started this virtual program with the topic of pandemic because the crisis coincided with the start of our new role as co-chairs. So we want to take these issues seriously, while at the same time, we want to keep the optimism in our profession, discussing what we are learning, what we can do now and in the future. We want to keep hosting discussions that would help us make productive and well-informed contributions in whatever forms in each one's expertise in the future. So thank you very much again to all the participants and everyone in the audience for joining us today. We truly appreciated your time. And we will be announcing the time, a date and time for the next event. So please stay tuned and stay safe. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much.
Thank you for not eating lunch.